And so the talk is going to focus on Indigenous leadership and responsibility, where science, culture, and policy connect. And the keynote will highlight the importance of engagement of Indigenous peoples in the regulatory process, as well as the benefits of including that knowledge into that process. So she'll be discussing fisheries management, and changes in some of the approaches with which we incorporate and include Indigenous knowledge systems in management and regulation. And finally, she'll be talking about Indigenous ways of knowing, highlighting some of the perspectives of fishers, and talking a little bit about how, at a deeper level, I think, reinforcing language, traditional foods, and different ways of knowing can translate into policy change, and then also greater community involvement and buy-in and participation in a variety of different levels. And so she'll touch on the state level with the State Board of Fish, national level in terms of national strategies for inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, and then at the global level with the Arctic Council. And so with that, welcome Dr. Mack.
Bring this down to my level here. Ong everybody, Kamagala, Aluk Tatua Sakta Cooking, Agdago Ilana Kakta Cooking. Hello and good afternoon. I'm Dr. Liza Mack. I was born and raised in King Cove, Alaska, an Aleut fishing community at the end of the Eastern Aleutians. Excuse me. First of all, thank you to Matt for the introduction, and thank you to the North Pacific Research Board and the organizers for inviting me as a keynote speaker. When I was asked to be a keynote speaker at AMSS, it was actually I'm very honored, but also very intimidated. There's a lot of data in the room always up there, and I don't have a whole lot of that. But I had gone through the IGERT MESIS program at UAF, and so being around a lot of the biology and the oceanography and all of the fishery science has really been part of my own education and going through my PhD program. So it's really nice to be part of this crowd here. So for me, this keynote is an important time to illustrate the Unangan connection to the ocean and the importance of participation in the regulatory process. I will use my own background and experience to illustrate the complexities and also the connection that these ties have to governance, and also to showcase how the incorporation of Indigenous ways of knowing has become more sought after and recognized on multiple levels. So when I was thinking about how to kind of wrap my head around a keynote speech, and really I've been thinking about this since they asked me to do it, but really kind of thinking about what the messaging should be and the message, what I wanted to convey to you today. As I was kind of thinking through this picture came up on my feed of boats of Sand Point. And this is the fishing vessel, the Glenwood. And the guy in the yellow shirt is actually my dad. He fished on this boat with my uncle, Eddie Mack Sr., for over 40 years. So this is a fishing tender, and the tenders are in charge of offloading the smaller boat catches from the salmon grounds and taking them back to the canneries. King Cove was actually established in 1911 with the construction of the cannery there. So we have been living in King Cove for over 100 years. My dad, who is in this picture, constantly talks about the trips on the Glenwood. He talks about crossing the Gulf and saving boats and taking fish and living and witnessing the changes and the ebbs and flows of what happens in the oceans. He talks about navigation, about time, course, and compass, and how that is important in being able to navigate prior to when you had all of the fancy equipment that we have now. But the depth of knowledge that he has, and the depth of knowledge of all of these people who make up the fleets in our communities, have a depth of knowledge and experience that is complemented by the inherent knowledge passed down. And this is what I hope the crux of this talk is, and that it resonates with all of you. A lot of my approach to research is stemmed from political ecology. So the way that I think about it is understanding that political ecology is present in our everyday lives, especially for those of us in Alaska. Political ecology is to understand the complex relations between nature and society through a careful analysis of what one might call forms of access and control over resources and their implications for environmental health and sustainable livelihoods. Access to resources in the Eastern Aleutians is imperative for everyday life. The Aleut people who live there have survived there for generations, maintaining a balance within the landscape. The changes that we see to the social ecological systems highlights the ways in which power plays a role in the activities that are practiced by Alaska's Native people in both the Eastern Aleutians and throughout the state. Political ecology stresses that ecological systems have political dimensions and that their ideas about the systems are produced through political and economical processes. This is a picture of King Cove. The Aleut people who live here have been a part of the ecosystem for thousands of years. The population pre-contact was estimated to have been between 16,000 and 20,000 Aleut people. The traditional Unanga societies were situated around salmon streams and migrating animals. Today, the population of Aleut village has declined dramatically from pre-contact estimates. However, they are still very much sustainable and vibrant. Our villages today are complex and diversified in ways in which they previously have been. However, the communities that are smaller and therefore the number of people that are available to do all the jobs needed to keep a community thriving is limited. In order to have the ability to grow and enhance and sustain the villages, we need a lot of resources. So people in communities often wear multiple hats, they sit on multiple boards, they run successful fishing operations, they travel back and forth to meet with our legislators, and they provide for their families. Subsistence has always played a large role in our communities. When you grow up, there's always a focus on hunting and gathering and putting up fish. This picture here is a picture of my son and another boy, and they were down in Atka. There is a picture of padarkis, or black katy chitons, and there's also a picture of umgu, or octopus. In the Aleutians, we say, when the tide is out, the table is set. So being able to continue to teach our children to go out and harvest and to be able to gather from the beaches and gather from the sea is really important. It's part of the learning that is also part of the traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge that is passed down. The knowledge of hunting and fishing practices are not mutually exclusive to commercial or subsistence, since they are both interrelated. This is a picture of my uncles. They are very knowledgeable in many things, but subsistence, traditional knowledge, and advocacy all play a role in everyday life in the Aleutians. As mentioned, our people have lived in the Aleutians for millennia, utilizing the land, the sea, for food, shelter, clothing, and spiritual guidance. The land and sea provide lifeways that are the cornerstone of our culture. Subsistence to Unanga people is more than the word. It is the basis for our culture and the tools we need to survive in the region. In our world, knowing the tides and migration patterns and preservation mechanisms of food have led the Aleuts to be successful. This includes being able to know the things about the weather, what you can expect when the different winds are blowing, and also what to expect from the tides. During my dissertation research that I finished in 2019, I had the opportunity to talk to many different fishermen and advocates from our community. And one of the fishermen actually told me a lot about how to actually look for fish and to look for salmon. He explained that a person must watch for rips, which are the colored bands in the water and show where the tide is running, and that you'd be able to see the fish inside them. Being able to see rips at a certain time indicates where the fish are and where to set the net. Also, knowing which way the tide is running and how the ocean is moving would dictate when you set the net. The explanation may seem simplistic, but it illustrates an understanding of water columns that shows an understanding of oceanography, the movement of the water, the intimate connection to the landscape developed over thousands of years, and passing down this knowledge to family and community ensure the future survival of our communities. You need to understand the bathymetry of the open ocean floor and how that not only affects our nets, but also the behavior of the fish is important. It shows an understanding of identification of species from one another and also the composition of the fish being targeted. Specific knowledge and words are used to describe the environment, and this is evident. Elders discuss knowledge about the landscape and how they use the environment to assist in gathering food and resources they need for their families. This picture here is of a fisherman named Radion Kazakin. And when we were talking, I was talking with an elder about fishing, well, about science, really. And I said, well, what is the Unangak word for science? And what she shared was that there really isn't an Unangak word for science. She said, Tuku mach maktahim ida taku, or the chief knows what he has to do. Basically, all of those things that I just talked about, being able to read the ocean, to understand the tides, to understand the bathymetry, to understand the stock composition of fish that are present in your community is huge. Also understanding, for example, when to eat clams or when to not eat clams. And these are all potentially life and death situations. By being able to understand what you have in your environment and how to use that to the best of your ability, and also how to not over-harvest that so that it's there for continued generations. The thing that I really like about this picture is the fact that he's on his roof and he's putting up fish. Down in the Eastern Aleutians, we have a lot of bears, and there's always a lot of bears up by their house, and so instead of just having your dry fish down there ready to be stolen, sometimes you have to compromise. This part of Indigenous knowledge has been getting, or just the idea of Indigenous knowledge, is something that we as Indigenous people know, and something that we have known for a long time. But there's been a shift in the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge in policymaking and actually being able to actively acknowledge that it exists, and it can exist with Western science as well. On December 1st, 2022, the Biden-Harris administration formally recognized Indigenous knowledge as one of the many important bodies of knowledge that contributes to scientific, technical, social, and economic advancements in the United States, and also to the collective understanding of the natural world. This recognition statement is very important because it also gives legitimacy to the things that we know and have known as Native people. It's not just in the United States, in the Arctic Greater. The Arctic Council also recognizes Indigenous knowledge as a way of knowing and as something that needs to be consulted. The Arctic Council, if you guys don't know, is made up of 8 nation-states and 6 permanent participants. The permanent participants are the Indigenous people who are represented in 1 or more country, and there are 6 working groups. the thing that's unique about the Arctic Council is not only that it is a consensus-based organization, but it's also an organization where Indigenous people from around the Arctic have a seat at the table. They have a seat at every one of the working groups. They have a seat at the senior Arctic officials. They have a way to bring this knowledge and bring these stories and bring our realities as Native people, as Indigenous people, to the table to fill in a lot of the context that they wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. One of the efforts that we were able to participate in was the meaningful engagement of Indigenous people in marine activities. And this was a publication that was put out in May of 2019, but it had been worked on for many years with, within the PAIM working group, and that's the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment. And it also was able to be, it was a joint effort, and it's a really good piece of, work that we could use to kind of set them the stage. In order to contribute to a lot of the policy decisions and natural resource management discussions, one of the things that we're active in doing in our region, and in other regions I think is the same, is hosting culture camps. Making sure that our kids have ties to their culture, how they understand history, how they are still part of the environment. This here is a picture of kids in Atka. The thing that was amazing about the Atka Culture Camp, I think we were down there in 2019, so right before the pandemic, but all the food we got while we were there. So they had gone out and they had hunted reindeer, they had hunted ducks, you can fish for halibut off of the beach, we got a sea lion, they had a seal, I mean, so it was just all native foods that we collected. We had set the net and gotten, I think, 30-some red salmon, and we were able to smoke salmon, but we were also able to eat. So we were able to live off the bounty of our land that we have for thousands of years. This is another picture of culture camps. This is a picture of the Sandpoint culture camps. All these culture camps have been happening. I think Sandpoint is in their 20-something year, but they get to do stuff like make drums, do beading, dance, and language. All this ties you back to your culture. The language is something that is deep, it's old, and it's important for our children to be able to experience and to be able to put forward. My dad is one of 19 children, and him and his brothers and sisters still speak Unangam Tanu. It doesn't seem like a lot because we grow up hearing it, and even if it is just small phrases like akada or brought or some other words, you're still hearing words that are in Unangam Tanu. So it's really something that is long-standing and is really important to continue. I want to talk a little bit about advocacy. Within Alaska, there are multiple layers of governance that grant and restrict access to resources in the state. As the power and infrastructure has shifted, so too has the ways that Unangam people interact with the landscape. The so-called discovery of Alaska, followed by its purchase by the United States, initiated the start of many regulatory processes that are still in place today. The Aleut people play an active role in the conversations and decision-making processes that happen in the state. Participating in these conversations begins early for some Aleut people. The range of first exposures to these topics varies by family and by community. Many people have stories about taking their children to meetings in Anchorage, and because no child care is available, the children attend the meetings. My experience has been that once a person becomes involved, that person is encouraged to stay involved. With such a small population, people encourage anyone showing an interest in learning and participating in regional, statewide, national, and international conversations to continue to work and develop the skills and relationships that will allow people to continue living in the region. Many people have a very long history of advocacy. The gentleman in the photo is David Osterbach Sr., and my dad. And then the picture on the left-hand side is his boat. It's a wooden 58-footer called the Pacific Maid. But David O is an example of someone who has dedicated their life to advocacy. He was recognized by the state of Alaska in 2017 for his contributions to the Sandpoint Advisory Council. He was awarded one of the Advisory Committee Excellence in Service Awards. One of the things that he was recognized for was his ability to mediate difficult issues among 3 commercial gear types, set, drift, and seine in the area, offering a humble and modest demeanor which has led to the successful representation of the Advisory Committee's recommendations before the board. Along with the long history of advocating for fisheries, David was instrumental in assisting with the school boards in the 1970s. He noted that besides his wife, he's only had one boss. After returning from the Air Force, he was recruited by the superintendent of the Alaska State Operating School Systems in 1972 to be the director of Rural Advisory School Boards, which provided training activities to 247 rural advisory school boards. David is just one example, and there are many others. But in general, being involved in these processes are recognized as an important part of being able to continue cultural practices. When I asked one fisherman whether or not he was going to go to the meetings, he just told me, "That's not my job, that's your job, I just fish." But when talking about this, it's really important to speak up for our fishermen and for our fisheries. There are several people who are looked to participate in many meetings, but in a lot of cases, I think that people are intimidated by the laws and the multiple layers of governance that are present. And so being able to communicate back and forth between our stakeholders and our policymakers is really, really important. One of the cornerstones of our culture, and of obviously many other cultures, is our dependence on the resources available outside the doors, not for ease of access, but for nutritional value and positive benefits that these foods have on our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Even today, taking our young children out in the landscape, you start to harvest things that you have in the past. The challenge is that sometimes conflicts exist between the ideas about how people have and how people should live on the landscape and the regulatory and management perspective. In our area, subsistence and commercial fishing are interrelated. They are one and the same. I'll say that again. Commercial and subsistence fisheries in our area are one and the same. We do them simultaneously, and I don't know if you noticed in the first picture, I'll go back to it in a minute, but on the Glenwood, there's actually fish hanging up on the rafters. This has always been practiced in our region. These are just some pictures of my niece getting some fish eggs, and those are beef from Sanac, and my aunt teaching my little boy how to pick mossberries, and obviously it was a really good salmonberry year that year as well. But one of the things this brings up for me is also a tie to a North Pacific Research Board project called Sanac Birds. This is actually a 2-part project, and what it is looking at seabird diet changes over the past 4,000 years. And it's looking at the archaeological record from Sanac Island. And it analyzes the stable isotope ratios of nitrogen and carbon. We have over 25,000 specimens of bird bones that were excavated from Sanac Island. And understanding these changes in the seabird foraging habits can tell us more about the climatic changes that we've seen over the years. One of the very interesting facts that we've already seen within this set of bones is that Unang people have been present on Sanak Island. They're from 4,000 years ago, and there's also stuff that dates to 150 years ago. So that is presence the entire time, which is pretty incredible, I think. One of the ways that we are talking about this and communicating the project is through art. This is also a part that was funded by the North Pacific Research Board. The woman in the middle is Danielle Larson. You guys might recognize her. She has the beautiful jarred fish art that you see. She painted us a one-of-a-kind mural that is in Sandpoint, and it talks about, or what we hope that it shows is interest in these birds. But the birds that we have here, they were all cut out and they're all life-size so that kids can go up and actually measure their arm's length to the different foraging birds that have been also present in the time between this 4,000 and 150 years ago. That brings me to talking about fishing and being present on the landscape. Fisheries in the Aleut region is generational. It is taught to younger kids. It is something that has always been a family operation, and it's something that's near and dear to our hearts. This is salmon that was made by my Auntie Myrtle, and it's jarred fish, and it's something that we learn to do and we learn to respect. I think that participation in policy is a part of culture. We are encouraged to speak on the behalf of our elders and our environments, and the access to the resources, I think, is critical to the health of our communities. It supports our infrastructure, and it supports our families, and it supports our mental health and well-being. Fish in Alaska is a basis for all of our cultures around the state, and I think working together to protect our fisheries is the best way forward. I think that the information and some of the dialogues and conversations that are going to be had this week are very important, and I'm excited to be a part of them and to learn from you about some of the research that you're doing and how that contributes to the greater cause. So just in conclusion, this is my dad's family, the Mack family of King Cove. And that's my dad teaching my little boy how to clean an octopus. These are some of the words, just some common words in Unangam Tanu, but all of that contributes to being able to be part of our culture and our community, being able to be included and being able to continue the practices that we have been doing for thousands of years is really important. So encouraging the next generations to not only practice their culture, but to advocate for our people and our communities has been instilled in us for a long time. And so with that, I guess Kagasakun, thank you.